The land refused them that year. September came dry, and the wheat stood brittle in fields that stretched toward a horizon empty of promise. What little grain the threshers pulled carried black rot inside the husks. By October, families along the township roads outside Harlow County were measuring flour by the spoonful, stretching butter thin across bread that crumbled at the touch. The Kellerman farm sat 3 miles east of the crossroads, a property that had belonged to the family since before statehood. 200 acres worked by 3 generations, anchored by a white farmhouse with green shutters and a barn built from timber cut on the land itself. Martha Kellerman ran the household after her husband's death in the winter of 1887, alongside her eldest son Jacob, 23 years old that autumn, and her daughter Ruth, who was 19 and unmarried. They were not alone in their struggle. The entire county faced the same withering season, but the Kellermans carried something heavier than drought or crop failure. They carried silence about the harvest of 1889. The county records kept at the courthouse in Harlow show nothing unusual about that year. Tax assessments list the Kellerman property at its standard valuation. The census taker's ledger from 1890 records 3 inhabitants at the address. The Methodist Church registry notes regular attendance by Martha and Ruth through November. What the records do not show requires looking elsewhere. In the private correspondence of Reverend Samuel Whitmore, held now by the County Historical Society, there exists a letter dated November 17, 1889, addressed to the Episcopal bishop in Indianapolis, but apparently never sent. The letter sits folded among Whitmore's papers, the envelope unsealed, the message unfinished. Your Grace, I write to you in circumstances that trouble my conscience beyond measure. There are matters occurring in this parish that I fear exceed my capacity to address. The families here grow desperate as winter approaches. I've heard talk that disturbs me greatly, proposals made in jest that I fear may be taken seriously. One among them, a Mrs. K, has spoken of old ways, of practices her grandmother knew. She says there are bargains that can be made when God turns his face away. The letter ends there. Reverend Whitmore would leave Harlow County in January of 1890, citing ill health. He never returned to ministry. Martha Kellerman was 61 years old in 1889. She had emigrated from Pennsylvania as a young bride, arriving in what was then newly opened territory. Her husband Elias had built the farm from cleared forest, raising crops and children in equal measure. Of 5 children born, 3 survived past infancy. The 2 youngest, Jacob and Ruth, remained on the land after their older sister married and moved to Chicago. Those who knew Martha before that autumn described her as a practical woman, neither warm nor cold, but steady in her obligations. She attended church, kept accounts, managed the household with the efficiency of someone who had survived harder times than most remembered. She was literate, uncommon for women of her generation in that region, and maintained correspondence with relatives back east. Her last letter to her sister in Philadelphia, dated September 3, 1889, survives in family papers. The situation here grows more serious each week. The harvest is worthless. Jacob works himself to exhaustion trying to salvage what he can, but I fear it will not be enough. We have stores to see us through winter if we are careful, but spring planting will require seed we cannot afford to purchase. The bank has already extended what credit they dare. Others are worse off than we are. The Hendersons lost their youngest to fever last week. Sarah Prewitt's husband took the children and left for the city, seeking work. She remains here with her mother, waiting. There is talk of desperate measures, though I pray it does not come to that. No further letters from Martha Kellerman exist in the family collection. The land around Harlow County was settled primarily by families from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia, bringing with them the agricultural practices and beliefs of their regions. Among the older generation, those born in the 1820s and 1830s, there persisted certain understandings about the relationship between land and those who worked it. These were not written down, not spoken of openly, but they existed nonetheless in the form of folk practice, seasonal rituals, and unspoken agreements about what the earth required in exchange for its yield. Most of these traditions had faded by the 1880s, dismissed as superstition by younger families educated in consolidated schools, connected by railroad to larger cities, exposed to modern agricultural science. But in years of crisis, old knowledge surfaces. In times of genuine desperation, people reach back toward whatever their grandparents believed might help. The county newspaper, the Harlow Weekly Beacon, ran a brief notice on September 28, 1889. A meeting will be held at the Grange Hall on Saturday evening, October 5th, to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding the present agricultural situation. All landholders welcome. Discussion will focus on cooperative purchasing of seed stock and spring planting strategies. 17 families attended that meeting. No minutes were kept, or if they were, they have not survived. But what happened afterward suggests the gathering involved more than discussion of seed purchasing. Jacob Kellerman was engaged to be married that year. His intended, Clara Dietrich, was the daughter of a neighboring farmer whose land adjoined the Kellerman property to the south. The engagement had been announced in July, with a wedding planned for the following June after spring planting was complete. Clara's younger brother, Thomas Dietrich, kept a diary during those years. The diary remained in family possession until 1954, when it was donated to the state archives. An entry from October 7, 1889 reads, "Clara came home from visiting the Kellermans very quiet today. She would not speak at dinner and went to her room early. Mother asked what troubled her, but Clara only said she was tired. Later I heard her crying through the wall between our rooms. When I asked if she was well, she said, 'They are talking about things that should not be spoken of.' Mrs. Kellerman knows old words. She says there are ways to ensure the land gives what it should, but the cost is more than money." I asked what she meant, but Clara would not explain further. She made me promise not to repeat what she said. I give my word, but I write it here because I am troubled by the fear in her voice. 2 weeks later, on October 22nd, Clara Dietrich broke her engagement to Jacob Kellerman. No reason was given publicly. The Dietrich family attended a different Methodist church across the township line beginning in November. Thomas Dietrich's diary makes no further mention of the Kellermans, the creature that would later be spoken of in whispers, the thing that community memory would eventually blame for what occurred that autumn had no name at first. It existed only as an idea, a justification, a shared understanding that something beyond human control had demanded what was given. Later, much later, after those who participated in the events were dead or had moved away, after the land changed hands and new families occupied the old farms, the stories began to solidify. The creature gained attributes. It moved through fields at night. It took shapes that resembled natural things, but were not quite right. It had been there since before settlement, waiting. It required feeding in years of poor harvest, or it would take more than what was offered. These stories were false. They were constructed backward from guilt, assembled from fragments of folklore and biblical imagery, and half-remembered tales from other places. They were easier to believe than the truth. The truth was simpler and darker. There had been no creature. There had been only people, desperate and afraid, who convinced themselves that certain old practices might save them, who told themselves they were following tradition, honoring agreements their grandparents had understood, ensuring the survival of the community, who chose to believe they were being forced rather than choosing. In the week following the October 5th meeting at the Grange Hall, several children disappeared from farms around Harlow County. The first was 9-year-old Samuel Henderson, whose family had already lost a child to fever in August. The second was Ada Carmichael, age 7, from a farm 4 miles north of the Kellerman property. The third was Peter Grayson, the youngest son of a family that worked shares on land they did not own. The pattern was specific. Each child was from a family represented at the October 5th meeting. Each was not the oldest child, not the one who would inherit land or carry on the family name, but a younger sibling, often sickly or small for their age. Each disappeared on a night when the moon was dark, taken from their beds without struggle, without sound, as if they had simply ceased to exist. The local sheriff, a man named Benjamin Hawthorne, conducted investigations. His reports, preserved in county records, are brief and increasingly frustrated. October 14th, responded to report of missing child at Henderson Farm. No signs of forced entry. Parents claim child was sleeping in loft when last checked. Extensive search of property and surrounding fields yielded nothing. Parents distraught but unable to provide useful information. October 19th, second child reported missing, Carmichael Farm, similar circumstances. Beginning to suspect coordination between cases. Parents extremely reluctant to discuss details. Investigation hampered by lack of cooperation from witnesses. October 25th. Third disappearance. Parents of missing child refuse to press charges or assist investigation. When pressed, father stated, "It is done. Leave us alone. Cannot proceed without cooperation. Am requesting assistance from state authorities." No state assistance came. The files note that Sheriff Hawthorne submitted his resignation on November 1st, 1889, citing personal reasons. He left Harlow County and did not return. Ruth Kellerman did not attend the October 5th meeting. Women were not generally included in Grange discussions, though several wives accompanied their husbands that night. Ruth spent the evening at home, as she recorded in a personal journal that was found decades later during renovation of the farmhouse. The journal is unusual for its candor. Most diaries of the period, particularly those kept by unmarried women, adhere to certain conventions. Discussions of weather, social visits, domestic tasks, carefully modulated feelings. Ruth's entries are different. They read as if she wrote for no audience but herself, documenting not just events, but her assessment of them, her doubts, her observations of the people around her. From October 1st, 1889, "The wheat is gone. Jacob will not admit it, but I see how he looks at the fields when he thinks no one is watching. Mother has begun rationing the preserves, marking each jar with chalk to track usage. She is planning for scarcity, though she tells us not to worry. I'm not worried about winter. I'm worried about spring, about seed we do not have, about debts coming due in March. I'm worried about the look in Mother's eyes when she thinks about the land passing out of family hands. This farm is all she has left of Father. She would do anything to keep it." From October 6th. Mother returned from the Grange meeting very late. Jacob was with her. They went immediately to Father's study, the room Mother has kept locked since he died. I heard them talking through the door, but could not make out words. When they emerged, Mother looked 10 years older. Jacob would not meet my eyes. Something was decided last night, something that troubles them both. I am afraid to ask what it was. From October 12th. Mr. Henderson came to the house today. He spoke with Mother in the parlor, while Jacob and I waited in the kitchen. We could hear raised voices, though not clearly enough to understand. When Henderson left, he looked ill. Mother sat at the table for a long time after, staring at her hands. Finally, she said, "We do what we must for those who remain." I asked what she meant. She told me to pray for the Henderson family, that they were making a sacrifice for the good of the community. The way she said sacrifice made me cold. From October 14th. They are saying young Samuel Henderson ran away. Everyone knows this is a lie. That boy was afraid of the dark, would not cross the yard at night without his father's hand. Yet the Hendersons themselves tell this story, standing in church on Sunday with their faces like stone, repeating that their son chose to leave. No one challenges them. No one asks the obvious questions. There is an agreement among the families now, a shared understanding that certain things will not be discussed. I see it in how they look at each other, how they fall silent when others approach. Jacob has become one of them. Mother too. I am the only one who seems disturbed by this. From October 20th, another child is gone, the Carmichael girl. The same lie is told, that she wandered off, that she must have lost her way in the fields. Her mother stood in the mercantile yesterday buying black cloth for mourning clothes, while maintaining her daughter is still lost, still might be found. The contradiction seems not to trouble anyone but me. Or perhaps others are troubled, but choose silence. What kind of community have we become, that we cannot speak truth about our own children? The journal entries cease on October 24, 1889. The final entry reads, "They have asked our family to participate. Mother has agreed. I argued against it with everything I could say, every moral principle I could invoke. Jacob stood silent, which is his way of consenting. Mother simply said, 'You do not understand what is at stake. You have not carried the responsibility of keeping land, of ensuring survival. When you are older, when you have your own children to feed, you will understand that some choices have no good answer, only less terrible ones.' She is wrong. I will never understand this. I will never forgive it. But I am only one voice, and I am not enough. The children were never found. No bodies were recovered. The official explanation, repeated in newspaper accounts and county records, was that a series of unrelated tragedies had befallen the community. Children lost to exposure, to wildlife, to the dangers inherent in rural life. That 3 should vanish within 2 weeks was unfortunate, but not impossible. But in a community as small as the townships around Harlow County, where families had known each other for generations, where news traveled through church socials and market days and chance encounters on township roads, the truth could not be fully suppressed. It became instead distorted, transformed into something that could be lived with. The transformation began slowly. Someone mentioned seeing strange tracks near where Ada Carmichael was last known to be. Someone else recalled an old story their grandmother had told about things that lived in the fields before settlement. A third person spoke of hearing sounds at night, movements through the wheat that were not made by wind. These fragments accumulated. They merged with existing folklore, with biblical imagery of demons and unclean spirits, with indigenous stories half understood and misremembered. Within a year, the creature existed as the accepted fact among those who needed to believe in it. It had been there all along, they said. It had always taken children in years of poor harvest. The families who lost children had been victims, not participants. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply been unlucky, chosen by forces beyond human control. The alternative, that parents had selected their own children, had coordinated their disappearances, had committed acts too terrible to name in pursuit of some imagined agricultural salvation, was impossible to acknowledge. So it was not acknowledged. It was covered over year by year, story by story, until the original events became legend, then myth, then cautionary tale told to keep children from wandering too far from home. The harvest of 1890 was abundant beyond all expectation. Wheat prices were high that year due to poor yields in other regions. Farmers around Harlow County, who had faced ruin 12 months earlier, found themselves solvent, even prosperous. Debts were paid, land was kept. Children who remained were well fed through the following winter. No one spoke of why this might be. No one suggested connection between the harvest and what had occurred the previous October. The families who had participated in the October 5th meeting maintained their silence, went about their business, raised their surviving children, grew old maintaining the fiction that tragedy had simply visited them and passed on. But patterns can be discerned by those who look carefully at the records. The Kellerman farm remained in family hands until 1923, when Martha Kellerman died at age 95. Jacob never married. Ruth left home in 1890, appearing next in city directories for Chicago, where she worked as a seamstress and lived alone until her death in 1931. She never returned to Harlow County, never corresponded with her family after her departure, never spoke publicly about her childhood. Among her effects found by a landlady after her death was her journal from 1889. Also found was a larger manuscript, apparently written over many years, that attempted to document what she knew or suspected about the events of that October. The manuscript was incomplete, poorly organized, and in places nearly illegible. But its central argument was clear, that the children had not been taken by any supernatural entity, but had been deliberately killed by their own community in a collective act of ritual murder, justified by revival of old agricultural practices that should have remained buried with previous generations. Ruth titled this manuscript The Pact of the Final Harvest. She never published it, likely understanding that no one would believe her, or worse, that those who knew the truth would ensure her silence. The manuscript was discovered by researchers in 1968 and is now held by the Chicago Historical Society. Rarely accessed, poorly catalogued, dismissed by most who encounter it as the ravings of a disturbed woman trying to make sense of childhood trauma. Perhaps they are right to dismiss it. Perhaps Ruth, having left home under circumstances that estranged her from her family, constructed an explanation for events she did not fully understand. Perhaps the children really were lost to accident and misfortune, and the timing was merely coincidental. But there are details in Ruth's account that cannot be easily explained away. She describes things she could not have witnessed directly, but that align with physical evidence later discovered. She provides names of participants that match families who attended the October 5th meeting. She quotes conversations that were never meant to be overheard, that revealed planning and coordination and careful attention to which children would be least missed, which losses could be absorbed without destroying family lines. The physical evidence, such as it exists, is fragmentary and open to interpretation. In 1934, during excavation for a new grain elevator near the site of the old Kellerman barn, workers uncovered a stone-lined pit about 6 feet deep and 4 feet in diameter. Inside the pit were bones, small bones, identified by the county coroner as belonging to children between the ages of 6 and 10. 3 distinct individuals, the coroner reported, based on skull fragments and long bone measurements. The discovery made the local newspapers. The explanation offered was that the pit was likely an old cemetery, possibly from the settlement period before the township had established proper burial grounds. That the bodies had been interred together in an unmarked pit was unusual but not unprecedented. Pioneer families, it was suggested, sometimes made expedient burial arrangements in times of crisis. This explanation was accepted. The bones were reinterred in the county cemetery with a small marker that read, "Unknown Children, Pioneer Period." No investigation was conducted. No connection was made to the disappearances of 1889, which by 1934 had faded from living memory, survived only in fragmented family stories that most dismissed as exaggeration. But there exists one piece of evidence that ties the 1934 discovery directly to the events Ruth Kellerman documented. Among the bones found in the pit was a small object that the workers initially overlooked. A brass button, corroded but still identifiable, bearing the maker's mark of a Philadelphia company that manufactured children's clothing between 1875 and 1892. The button matched descriptions in the Henderson family Bible of clothing worn by Samuel Henderson at the time of his disappearance. This detail was not mentioned in newspaper accounts of the 1934 discovery. It appears only in the coroner's notes, filed away and forgotten. The coroner himself, a man named Wallace Brennan who had lived in Harlow County his entire life, made a separate notation in his personal effects, found after his death in 1947. The pit was not a cemetery. The bones showed signs of deliberate arrangement, possibly ritualistic. The absence of burial goods, the manner of interment, the location near what was once cultivated land, all suggest something other than normal Christian burial. I believe these are the children who went missing in 1889 during what county historians call the Year of Shadows. My grandfather was sheriff that year, resigned his position rather than continue investigating those disappearances. Before his death, he told me, "Some crimes are committed by entire communities. You cannot arrest a community. You can only let it carry its guilt until time erases both crime and memory." I filed this as a pioneer cemetery because I have to live here, because some truths serve no purpose but to wound those who survive them. The Kellerman farmhouse stood until 1956, when it was demolished to make way for modern agricultural development. By then, the land had passed through several owners, none with any connection to the original family. The property was eventually consolidated into a larger corporate farm operation that exists today as part of a regional agricultural consortium. A historical marker stands near where the house once was. It reads, Kellerman Farm, Estero 1852. Pioneer homestead typical of 19th century agricultural settlement in central Indiana. Original structures demolished 1956. The Kellerman family contributed to the development of this county for 3 generations, adapting old-world agricultural practices to American soil and climate. Their dedication to the land exemplifies the pioneer spirit that built this region. The marker says nothing about what that dedication cost. It says nothing about the practices adapted from old world traditions. It says nothing about October 1889. But the stories persist in altered form. Ask older residents of Harlow County about their local history, and some will mention the creature that haunts the fields near where the Kellerman farm once stood. They will tell you it appears in years of poor harvest, that it takes the unwary, that it has been there since before settlement. They will tell you their grandparents remembered seeing strange things in the wheat, hearing sounds that were not quite animal and not quite human. They will show you where crops sometimes fail in irregular patterns, where nothing will grow despite soil that tests as fertile and healthy. These stories are comfortable. They allow the community to acknowledge that something terrible happened without accepting that it was done by human hands, by families they knew, by ancestors they honor. The creature becomes a scapegoat in the most literal sense, a vehicle for carrying away collective guilt, for transforming murder into misfortune, choice into inevitability. The truth is simpler and offers no such comfort. In October of 1889, faced with financial ruin and driven by desperation, 17 families in and around Harlow County, Indiana, made a collective decision to revive an agricultural practice that had not been openly performed in America for several generations. They convinced themselves they were honoring old traditions, ensuring survival of the community, making necessary sacrifices for the greater good. They selected 3 children, young enough to be vulnerable, old enough to understand their fate, chosen specifically for their expendability within family structures that valued some children more than others. These children were killed, almost certainly by suffocation to avoid visible injury, and their bodies were interred together in a pit dug for that purpose near the Kellerman barn, on land that would be planted with wheat the following spring. The families involved told themselves they were participating in a ritual exchange with forces beyond their understanding. They believed, or convinced themselves they believed, that the land required blood to give forth abundance. They believed their ancestors had known this truth, had practiced these rites in secret, had maintained the compact between farmer and soil through means modern religion condemned, but ancient wisdom justified. They were wrong. The harvest of 1890 was good, not because of what they had done, but because weather patterns shifted, because market conditions favored wheat that year, because fortune favors some and not others for no reason that can be controlled or predicted. The children died for nothing. Their deaths changed nothing. The families might have survived the poor harvest without this action, or they might not have. But their survival, when it came, was unconnected to their crime. Yet once the act was committed, once 3 children had been killed in secret coordination among 17 families, the participants could not acknowledge what they had done. They could not confess, could not seek forgiveness, could not even speak honestly among themselves about their own actions. They had to believe the ritual had worked, that the creature had been satisfied, that their prosperity was earned through sacrifice rather than received through random chance. So they built the myth. They transformed their crime into legend, their victims into offerings required by forces beyond human control, their guilt into a story about something that dwelled in the fields and demanded its due. And the community, desperate for an explanation that did not indict their neighbors or implicate their own families, accepted this story, repeated it, embellished it, until it became as true as any history written in official records. Martha Kellerman died in her sleep in January of 1923, having outlived most of her generation. Her obituary in the county newspaper praised her as a pillar of the community, a devoted mother, a faithful church member who had weathered both triumph and tragedy with grace and fortitude. Jacob Kellerman died 6 months later, having never spoken publicly about the events of October 1889. He left no diary, no confession, no acknowledgement of what he had done or failed to prevent. If he felt remorse, he carried it silently. If he believed he had been right to participate, he never said so. He simply lived his life, worked the land that had been saved by atrocity, and died without heir or legacy beyond acres that would soon be sold to strangers. Ruth Kellerman, who had refused to be silent but whose voice was never heard, died in Chicago in 1931 with her manuscript still unpublished, her account of the Pact unread, her insistence on truth dismissed as delusion or malice. Her belongings were boxed and stored, and eventually donated to an archive where they sit still, available to researchers who almost never come, documenting events that almost no one wants to believe. The children, Samuel Henderson, Ada Carmichael, Peter Grayson, have no graves, no monuments, no place where their names are remembered. The marker in the county cemetery identifies them only as unknown, their deaths attributed to the anonymous hardships of pioneer life rather than the specific cruelties of people who knew their names, saw them in church on Sundays, and killed them anyway. If there is a creature that haunts the fields where the Kellerman farm once stood, it is not the thing the stories describe. It is not an ancient evil that demands blood, not a supernatural force that can be appeased or avoided. It is only the accumulated weight of what was done there, the knowledge that cannot be fully suppressed, the guilt that persists even after all those who carried it are dead. The land itself remembers nothing. It grows corn now instead of wheat, worked by machines instead of family labor, owned by distant investors instead of people who live on it. The fields are productive, the soil is good, the harvests are measured in efficiency metrics rather than survival. There is no curse, no blight, no visible consequence of the past. But those who study such things closely, who examine crop yield data and soil composition reports, note small anomalies in the area near where the Kellerman barn once stood. Irregular patches where growth is stunted, where plants fail despite identical conditions to surrounding areas. These anomalies have no clear explanation. They persist year after year, moving slightly but never disappearing, as if the earth itself bears witness to something it cannot articulate. Perhaps this is coincidence, variations in subsurface composition or drainage patterns that modern agricultural science has not yet fully mapped. Perhaps it means nothing at all. Or perhaps Ruth Kellerman was right when she wrote, in the final pages of her manuscript, The land does not forget. We may tell ourselves stories, we may construct myths to hide from truth, we may die without confession and leave no trace of our crimes in official record. But the place where evil was done knows. The soil that received innocent blood carries that knowledge forward, not as curse or haunting or supernatural judgment, but as fact, simple, terrible, ineradicable fact. We killed children to save ourselves. We told ourselves it was necessary, that we were following old ways, that forces beyond our control demanded it. We were lying. We knew we were lying even as we spoke the words. And the land, which has no conscience and makes no judgments, simply holds what we put into it and gives back what it will, indifferent to our justifications, indifferent to our guilt, indifferent to everything but its own slow processes that outlast us all. The story of what happened in Harlow County in October 1889 exists now in three forms. First, there is the official version, a series of tragic accidents, children lost to the dangers of rural life, a community that rallied together to survive hard times and emerged stronger. This version appears in county histories, in historical society publications, in the comfortable narratives communities tell themselves about their past. Second, there is the folklore, the creature in the fields, the thing that takes the unwary, the supernatural force that must be respected or appeased. This version circulates in local stories, grows in embellishment with each telling, becomes divorced from any specific historical event and transforms into timeless legend. Third, there is the truth. 17 families, faced with ruin, convinced themselves that killing 3 children would save them. They did it. They lied about it. They protected each other through mutual silence. They died without accountability, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that most people prefer to ignore. Each version serves a purpose. The official history allows for civic pride. The folklore permits acknowledgement of darkness without assignment of blame. The truth offers no comfort, serves no function except to document what humans are capable of when they believe survival justifies anything. Most people prefer the first 2 versions. They are easier to live with. They allow Harlow County to be a place with history rather than a place haunted by specific named crimes committed by specific named people who were once neighbors and friends. But for those who look closely, who read Ruth Kellerman's manuscript or examine Dr. Brennan's private notes or trace the families who left the county in 1890 and never returned, the truth is visible. It sits in archives, poorly catalogued and rarely accessed. It waits in old journals and private letters and the kinds of documents that survive by accident rather than intention. It waits to be known, though most who encounter it choose to look away. The land continues. Corn grows where wheat once failed. Families build homes on farms that have passed through many hands. Children play in fields where other children were buried in an unmarked pit. Life continues because life always continues, indifferent to history, indifferent to justice, indifferent to the weight of the past that each generation inherits whether they know it or not. And somewhere in the accumulated silence of a community that chose fiction over accountability, the real creature persists, not in the fields, not in folklore, but in the human capacity to commit atrocity and then tell ourselves we had no choice, to kill for our own survival and then blame forces beyond our control, to maintain our own innocence by sacrificing both truth and the memory of those whose innocence we destroyed. This is the legacy of the Pact made in October 1889. Not supernatural horror, but the ordinary evil of people who convinced themselves they were doing what was necessary. Not monsters in the wheat, but the monstrous acts human beings commit when they believe their land, their prosperity, their way of life matters more than the lives of children who belong to that community and should have been protected by it. The harvest continued. The land gave what it would give. The story was told and retold until it became something other than truth, and the 3 children, whose names were Samuel and Ada and Peter, who were 9 and 7 and 8 years old when they died, were forgotten by everyone except the soil that received them and the silence that covered their deaths.